All right. So, hi everyone. My name is Matt. So, I am an individual with autism, and I'm just going to go right into my presentation. But I just want to say something really quick. So, I'm not going to pay attention to the chat right now. So, if anyone does have any questions, we're going to have a Q&A session later on at the end. So, if you do have questions, just please save them until the end, and then I'll answer any and all questions at that time. Thanks. So, this is my journey. Next slide, please. So being different. I always knew that something seemed off. It was just that as a child, I never understood exactly what that was. I always thought that it was others when in reality it was me. Next slide, please. Motor skills or lack thereof. As a child and even to this day, I have struggled tremendously with motor skills. Tying my shoes, buttoning my pants, using a zipper, catching a ball, and spatial awareness, among other motor-related skills, were incredibly difficult. Through occupational therapy as a child and having grown older, my motor skills have improved, but I still require help when learning new motor tasks as they don't come naturally to me. Next slide, please. Social challenges. In addition to motor skills, I struggled socially. When I was in preschool, if another kid approached me wanting to play, I would just smile and run away. I would also engage in parallel play and imitate what others were doing without really interacting with them. When others made jokes, I would not understand them and take it very literally. Next slide, please. Eye contact, which leads me to an incident in elementary school regarding eye contact. Another student accused me of staring at him, and I took it so literally that I avoided eye contact for the longest time, preferring to look down, fearful of being accused of staring at someone. Reading facial expressions. Speaking of eye contact, a related challenge was being able to read facial expressions. It was difficult for me to read others' emotions, and you can imagine the misunderstandings I have gotten into when someone looks sad and I had no way of being able to acknowledge that. This can still be a challenge today, but I've gotten much better at it. Next slide, please. Sensory issues. I remember as a child, I had sensory issues that mostly revolved around the sensation of touch. We had to cut off the tags on the back of my shirts because to me it felt like there was a needle digging into the back of my skin. Getting my clothing wet also caused me a great deal of discomfort, and even if I just got my sleeve a little bit wet, I would have to change out of that shirt. Now, the majority of these sensory issues no longer persist for me, but for many individuals with autism, sensory issues are a constant challenge. Next slide, please. Executive function and observance. So for many individuals, myself included, executive function is a challenge. So this would be transitioning from one task to another. Because we get so absorbed in tasks, it is often very difficult to change from one thing to another. Additionally, many individuals with autism have intense interests. As a child, I was very observant and would point out the most insignificant things, such as a light bulb missing in a classroom, or how the cable wires on the drive home from school looked odd because they were kind of all tangled together and squished. Next slide, please. Routine. So while having a routine is generally a good thing, I took it to the extreme as a child. I remember being picked up from school by my mother and how I would be adamant about how we would have to always take the same exact route home every single day. There was even a time where we just had to go to McDonald's every school after, sorry, there was a time that we had to go to McDonald's every day after school, regardless of whether or not we actually purchased anything, just because that was part of my routine. Next slide, please. Interests. So on the topic of taking things to the extreme, many individuals with autism have limited interests but are deeply into them. As a child, for some reason, I was really into trucks, particularly construction vehicles. I would make my grandmother stand with me in the street as I observed all the road construction. There was even a time when I was standing and I was just watching the construction vehicles that one of the workers offered me the opportunity to actually go into the backhoe with him. To this day, when I'm interested in something, I usually go all out into it and spend a lot of time with that particular interest. Next slide, please. Middle school. Middle school was a period of transition for me. So while I did well academically, I remember it being very difficult for me since it was the first time that I had multiple classes to go to. And as you know, because of executive functions issue, that was definitely a really big, new, difficult challenge for me. So my executive function challenges made this transition from one class to another very tough, and I had no idea why at the time. Furthermore, middle school was also a period of loneliness for me. I only had one person that I would really consider a friend, and I never attended any of the after school functions such as the dances, not because I didn't want to, but because I was too anxious and I had no one to go with. Next slide, please. High school. High school is much of the same as middle school, except that I made more attempts to try and be more outgoing and social. I had a small group of friends here and there throughout high school, but it felt incredibly superficial, and it was more like I was just in the group rather than actually a part of the group. I did meet one person, however, that I did consider a friend in high school, but towards the end of high school, I became even more lonely because he graduated 2 years before I graduated. So I ended up deciding not to attend graduation because I didn't have anyone I'd really be able to celebrate with and take pictures with. Next slide, please. So what prompted the diagnosis? So when I was 2 years old, I received a very vague diagnosis of neurological disorder due to delayed motor development. I had difficulty in preschool and was given yet again another vague diagnosis when I was 4 or 5 years old. Because I struggled socially in elementary school, I was finally diagnosed with something a bit more defined, that being nonverbal learning disorder. But it wasn't until the beginning of high school, after my parents saw how much I struggled socially, that I finally was diagnosed as having Asperger's at the age of 16. So finally, in 2018, I received a diagnosis of autism to receive regional center services. Despite receiving the Asperger's diagnosis at 16, autism meant nothing to me at the time, and Asperger's was just a label to me. Next slide, please. College. So the social challenges that I had throughout middle school and high school persisted in college. Like in high school, I made attempts at making friendships by joining clubs and trying to get involved in different activities. However, every attempt was met with failure, and I again had that feeling of being in the group but not truly a part of the group. I remember college not being a particularly happy time for me, that I just hoped to graduate as quickly as possible. I was also not receiving much support outside of my college's DSPS, since I had lost contact with my psychiatrist while in college. So although I graduated from UC Berkeley, it was not without many struggles. I did extremely well academically at Berkeley, but it is dangerous to conflate academic success with success in general. Next slide, please. Living independently. And so notice how I put independently in quotes. And the reason I do so is because even though I was living alone, I was not truly living independently. Both during my college and my first job in Vegas, I lived alone but struggled immensely. Cleaning, cooking, and even something as simple as taking out the trash were arduous tasks. Ultimately, cleaning rarely was done, and I tended to take out food and almost never cooked. I think that was a sense of being overwhelmed by so many tasks, which goes back to my executive function challenges that made all of this so difficult. I also believe that my deteriorating mental state, both in college and on my first job, made simple tasks such as taking the trash out so difficult. Next slide, please. My first job. So initially, I was very excited for my first job at Aria in Las Vegas, but that excitement quickly fell apart. I was completely overwhelmed by the lack of structure in my first job, having to live independently and feeling drained every day returning home from work. Furthermore, the work environment was incredibly social. I also did not receive any support nor accommodations, even after letting my manager know that I have autism. Not because they didn't care, but they simply did not have the knowledge, resources, or expertise to work with individuals who have autism. As an introvert, the social interactions made me feel incredibly anxious. The lack of direction and structure also caused me a lot of frustration and concern, as I was often unsure of what to do. It eventually got to the point in which I was so overwhelmed and depressed that I called home every night crying and complaining about how depressed I was. Next slide, please. Quitting. After only 3 or 4 months, I quit the job in disgrace. It was the lowest point in my life. I felt as if I had stayed as long as I could, but my mental state had deteriorated so much, and I knew that I needed professional help. I didn't want to quit the job because I felt like I was letting everyone down, particularly my parents, but I reached the point knowing that if I stayed any longer, I wouldn't be doing any favors for my mental health. It was a rocky few months after that. Next slide, please. Mental health. The recovery period was challenging. I remember being so depressed and disappointed that everything felt hopeless. A good analogy to represent my state of mind at the time was that each morning I would wake up with a huge boulder on top of me, and metaphorically, it felt impossible to will myself out of bed. Fortunately, I ended up seeking therapy and my mental state gradually improved. Next slide, please. Mind Institute. So I eventually attended a program at the UC Davis Mind Institute called the Access Program, which ended up changing my life. It was there that we learned about techniques to help us cope with challenges as well as practice social situations. The most notable thing about the Access Program was that the staff wanted those of us who were not working at the time to volunteer, which is something I ended up doing with an organization called Fly Brave. Next slide, please. Fly Brave. So Fly Brave is an autism advocacy organization that provides free events to individuals with autism. I ended up teaching a public speaking class and offering life coaching services to the other young adults there. Volunteering with Fly Brave changed my life. It was with Fly Brave that I built the self-confidence and self-esteem that I lacked throughout my entire life. I learned that I could speak to large audiences of people when not long ago it was a struggle to communicate with even just a single other individual. It was with my work in Fly Brave healing others that allowed me to heal myself, rejuvenating my mental state. From there, I decided that I wanted to dedicate my life to helping other individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities. Next slide, please. So Meristem. So I worked with an Ulta, the regional center Ulta vendor called DDSO, and one of the employees there suggested that I reach out to Meristem. I ended up doing so and have been employed with Meristem for, actually now it's more than a year, it's close to a year and a half now. So Meristem is a 3-year transitional program for young adults with autism and other developmental disabilities between the ages of 18 and 28. Meristem prepares students to live independently, enter the workforce, attend college, and have fulfilling lives. Next slide, please. Working at Meristem. So at Meristem, I work as a work skills instructor, job coach, and teach a variety of classes, including but not limited to communication and life coaching to help prepare our students for life after they graduate. I'm also a TAP or Transformative Autism Program trainer, and I've helped develop training modules that we've used to teach California employers best practices to hire, retain, and work with individuals with autism. Next slide, please. So the difference. I believe that there are a variety of reasons for my success while working at Meristem versus my unsuccessful experience at ARIA. First and foremost, at Meristem, we are doing work that is meaningful and rewarding to me. Both teaching our students and watching them develop, as well as my work teaching the TAP material to employees, has been very fulfilling work to me. In contrast, the work that I did at ARIA did not have that same sense of worth and fulfillment. Next slide, please. Difference continued. Having sought therapy, attending the Mind Institute's Access Program, and volunteering at Fly Brave, I'm in a very different place in my life than I once was when I worked at ARIA. Throughout my life, I've always had a very low self-esteem, but these experiences have all made me respect and recognize my own self-worth. My improved self-esteem has also led to a dramatic increase in my self-confidence to do whatever it is that I hope to achieve in my life. At ARIA, I lacked the ability to believe in myself and my abilities, which led to my failure. Next slide, please. Growth. I feel that I've grown tremendously in the short amount of time that I've been with Meristem. I have learned so much both professionally and individually, and I'm incredibly thankful for all of the experiences that I've had at Meristem. Meristem helps our students grow through our instruction, but it's through my work providing support to our students and working with California employers for TAP that I have actually grown myself as well. It was also through my interaction with both coworkers and our students that I have developed in the area that I had long lacked in, socially. I now co-teach a social skills class based on the development of a program in UCLA for young adults with autism called Peers. Next slide, please. So filling the chasm. So thankfully, autism is now recognized as a developmental disability that impacts millions of people. There are plentiful resources out there dedicated to children with autism, but when people age out of the system, resources disappear. I want to help fill that chasm with a particular emphasis on employability and trying to help work with and convince employers to hire qualified adults with autism. Thank you.